Nihilistic despair, exploitative package deals, or lame outsiders, the perceived available options for the spiritually desperate modern man. Bruce Charlton. For those of us who believe Thoreau was correct in his assertion that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and who believe that this negative condition derives from the mainstream materialist assumptions that this universe, and therefore our life, has neither purpose nor meaning, the various alternative possible ways of escape seem to the trapped and desperate like just so many self-interested, manipulative, spiritual package deals. In other words, the typical modern man lives by a set of fundamental assumptions that mean he has painted himself into a corner of despair, demotivation and disaffection, where nothing that is regarded as real, is relevant or helpful, and everything supposedly real, is impersonal and indifferent to his condition. Thus, one who is in such a situation, and who seeks personal purpose and meaning in life, will encounter an array of religious or spiritual packages. Each of these claims to offer, to varying degrees, and in various ways, a way out from the corner of pointlessness and meaninglessness, but at a cost. Meaning and purpose are offered, but only with a price on them. To one standing trapped in the corner, that cost is evidence of bogosity, of fraud, of attempted manipulation. The cost seems like just another example of the exploitative indifference of the world to the desperate condition of the sufferer. There are two types of package deal, traditional religious, and New Age. The cost of traditional religions is active church membership, the obedience and service owed to the human institution in return for the alleged spiritual benefits. The price of New Age spirituality is analogous but different in form, and typically entails buying books and other merchandise, or paying for lectures and workshops. Thus, from the perspective of the seeker, personal meaning and purpose have either been monetized, or else entail the quasi-medieval serfdom of time and labor for spiritual benefits. What is wanted and needed is disinterested, impartial, help in finding purpose and meaning, a source of help that has nothing this worldly to gain from the exchange. This largely rules out all professional sources, rules out all those whose livelihood depends, whether proximally or distally, on getting people to accept a package. Yet, of course, all the high-status, well-known, respected sources of guidance are professional, and gain from converts. The genuinely disinterested are almost certain to be obscure losers, and to strike the hard-nosed modern cynic as lame social rejects. Any source of guidance that is obvious and easily available is therefore likely to be regarded as corrupt, and indeed, as of 2023, is indeed likely to be corrupt, since such source must have made a deal with the evil world in order to attain their position of status, their income, their fame. This is probably one of the main reasons why so many, the mass of, people remain trapped in quiet, or not so quiet, desperation. They are self-trapped by their own unacknowledged and unexamined assumptions, and they reject all possible sources of assistance, either because these are seen to be peddlers of manipulative package deals, or else the disinterested sources of spiritual guidance are regarded as unrespected worldly failures, genuine outsiders whose obscurity and lack of influence seems like clear evidence that such losers cannot possibly have anything valuable to contribute. Soul music. William Wildblood. I have been listening to Wagner's opera Parsifal recently. For those who are interested in such things, it's the 1962 Bayreuth performance conducted by Hans Knappertsbusch, excellently recorded in stereo and featuring perhaps the last great generation of Wagner singers. I first heard orchestral extracts from Parsifal, specifically the prelude and Good Friday music, in my early 20s, but didn't listen to the whole opera until much later. I couldn't really get on with the singing and seeming long airs then, but now if I listen to Wagner, it's the operas as a whole I listen to, the Ring Cycle, especially Das Rheingold and Die Valkyrie, being my favorite with Parsifal a close second. No one can plumb the depth of Jungian archetypes like Wagner, almost literally so with the prelude to Das Rheingold. There is a spiritual intensity to his music which is quite different to the spiritual quality of, say, Tallis, or, different again, Bach, because it includes much more than these of the human element though less of the purely spiritual, as is only appropriate for romantic music. You might say it goes deeper but is less elevated. Those who don't believe that human consciousness has evolved should study Western music of the last 1,000 years. From the pure simplicity of medieval plain chant to the intricate harmonies of Renaissance choral polyphony through the more expressive and technically sophisticated Baroque and Romantic music and on to the 20th century when it all broke down, there is a clear progression with ever greater emphasis on self-consciousness. Wagner brought this to a pinnacle. After him there didn't seem anywhere left to go except for music to turn in on itself, and we are still struggling with that problem. The composer Cyril Scott in his book Music, Its Secret Influence Throughout the Ages wrote that Wagner touched the Buddhic plane, meaning a plane of high spiritual quality, on 2 occasions in his music, once with the Good Friday music in Parsifal and once with the prize song from the Master Singers of Nuremberg. One doesn't have to express this in his theosophical terms to recognize that these 2 pieces of music genuinely do have a spiritual quality like few others. This is real soul music. It has always seemed ridiculous to me that what is called soul music is so called. Maybe it's a kind of inversion typical of these latter days, since music of the soul is precisely what this kind of music is not. Soul, as in sensitivity to spirit and the higher dimensions of being, is just what is lacking here. It may be enjoyable music on its own terms, but those terms are of physical being with input from the emotional level, not spiritual in any proper sense at all. Real music of and from the soul inclines to contemplation, not sensual movement. The feelings it arouses are to do with reverence, majesty, awe, humility and the sublime, not frenetic excitement of mind and body. It may be that not all people are capable of feeling these, let's call them what they are, higher feelings, but it is a spiritually fatal mistake to pretend that the lower is the higher or that the 2 are in any way equal. They are not, and if you don't recognize this you will desensitize yourself to higher reality. It's no good saying everything has its place unless you see the lower in the light of the higher. Sometimes, often, that will put it in a very different light from how it sees itself. Geordie versus Geordie's hammer, beings and continuity through time, solving the paradox of the Ship of Theseus. Bruce Charlton. When time is recognized as part of a being, then we can also understand how a being can remain the same being, even if/when its component elements are all replaced. And we can also understand that when an entity is not a being, and its component parts are all replaced, then what results is no longer the same thing as it was to start with. This is the Ship of Theseus paradox from philosophy, but it is more clearly stated by the simpler example of contrasting Geordie the man, and Geordie's hammer. If we suppose that over the course of 50 years every cell in Geordie's body has been replaced, which isn't really true, because some nerve and muscle cells are preserved through the lifespan, but let's assume it. Then, despite that none of his component parts remain from 50 years before, we nonetheless regard Geordie as the same person as he was 50 years earlier. Whereas, by contrast, we regard Geordie's hammer, which has had 3 new iron heads and 12 new wooden handles during the 50 years, as not the same hammer as it was before, even if the replacement heads and handles are always shaped identically to the original. Why the difference between Geordie and his hammer? Why is the man regarded as being the same, even if his components are changed, even though he has transformed from child to youth, from young man to old man? Whereas the hammer, which looks and functions identically throughout, is nonetheless a different hammer. The difference is that Geordie is a being, and the hammer is not. It is of the nature of beings that their identity remains, despite whatever repairs, growth, development and transformation that being has undergone through time. Indeed, self-repair, growth, development and transformation are actually attributes of a being. Indeed, beings are always changing, they are dynamic, which is one way we recognize they are indeed beings. Beingness is thus continuous, it never ceases even for a moment. There is no paradox here, unless we start assuming that time can be excluded from our understanding, and/or assuming that time can be discontinuous, i.e. can stop, and start again, which is another way of assuming that time can be excluded from the understanding. If we try to understand beingness without reference to time and continuity, then we are driven to assume that beingness depends on some unchanged essence. If beingness were wholly material, that would mean that Geordie was no longer himself when all his component parts had been replaced. One traditional attempted solution of this difficulty is to posit an unchanging immaterial spirit, which persists as such even when the body is destroyed, and despite that the soul may change through time, for example, by learning from experience. But to say that the real Geordie is something eternal and unchanging, is to render all change to body and soul superficial and irrelevant in a context of eternity. This is to posit a reality in which the eternal essences of all beings, including all men, are unchanging. And this is, I believe, contradictory to the whole basis of Christianity, which assumes agency, and that our choices matter fundamentally and eternally plus. Plus this tends to lead back to a non-Christian oneness spirituality, where all of reality is assumed to be unified, perfect, unchanging, and all else is illusory. There is no space in such a scheme for God, Jesus or men as free agents, since all categories entail division, and are thus regarded as ultimately illusory. What of Geordie's hammer? Since the hammer is not a being, what is it? I would say the hammer, as a separable entity with meaning, is a component of Geordie's being, a part of Geordie's being. The hammer gets meaning from Geordie, but might also be shared by Geordie's friends, or given to another man, or other being, and then would get a somewhat different meaning by becoming part of a different identity. In general, not everything is a being, and those that are not beings will get their identity, will be recognizable and understandable and have purpose, from their association with one or many beings, through being known by other beings. Therefore, if it was possible that Geordie's hammer ceased to be known by any being, even God, it would simply become assimilated into chaos, that meaningless, purposeless stuff about which nothing can be said, because as soon as something is said of it, it ceases to be chaos. The UN-known hammer, since it is not a being, would cease to be a part of divine creation. But this presumably does not happen, because God, having known the hammer, would always know the hammer. Whereas a being is known to itself, since consciousness, of some kind, is an attribute of being, other attributes are life, purpose, change. Hence beings are eternal. Even if, as was originally the case, before creation, a being was unknown to God and had not, or not yet, been included in divine creation, it would nonetheless still continue to be. What all this tells me, is that we should be careful about how we talk and think about time, if we wish to avoid incoherence. If we start separating time from beings, and beingness, and start assuming that time can stop, or is discontinuous, then we create paradoxes when it comes to being. An analogous problem is Zeno's paradox of the Achilles and the tortoise. This incoherence derives from assuming that time can be understood as discontinuous, and can be broken into discrete segments. Similarly, when we try to understand being, we will run into paradoxes if we try to understand being in a timeless fashion. But if instead we regard being as a primary aspect of ultimate reality, and recognize that time is an attribute of being, then there is no paradox. Then being is understandable using ordinary, innate common sense, something even a child knows, without needing to be told. Note, being is here regarded as a primary category, therefore a being does not, cannot, have a definition. Anything that has a definition is not primary, since it can be further broken down. But being does have attributes. Intellect, instinct or intuition? Where best to direct our thinking consciousness? The meaning of true Romanticism. Bruce Charlton. When the modern era began, with Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, the idea and impulse emerged that men should not passively be ruled by unconscious instinct, but that instead we ought consciously to reason out our belief and behaviors by our intellect. At first there was the idea that intellect ought to be rooted in empirical, or perceptual, data, which led to the idea of science, broadly defined. Thus, for enlightenment our beliefs and behaviors ought to derive from conscious and intellectual reflection only on information derived from the senses, and from memories of sensory information, including memories encoded in writing and other symbolic systems such as mathematics. But a minority of men became aware that self-styled enlightenment and reason was, in practice, merely to swap a primordial unconscious passivity to instinct and nature, for a modern conscious passivity to human society. Such conscious passivity is normal nowadays, especially in public discourse, where the mass of men passively believe whatever is currently dominant in their perceptual environment, and then call this obedience to human power by the name of science. Instead of ancient men being unconsciously in accordance with the natural world, modern men consciously choose to live in accordance with a man-made world of ideology. The alternative is called Romanticism, which emerged from the middle 1700s when Enlightenment was reaching its height. True Romanticism was aiming at something unprecedented in human history, conscious awareness and choice to live by intuition, where intuition is the guidance and knowledge of our real and divine selves. Intuition was already and always there in us, but unconscious. Romanticism is the project of becoming aware of, and living in accordance with, this pre-existent intuition. Conscious thinking therefore ought to become directed at becoming aware of what our real selves are saying, at any given time, and these real selves were assumed to be attuned to ongoing divine creation. But Romanticism soon divided and diverted into an atavistic and false Romanticism, which became communist, and usurped the name of Romanticism. By this false Romanticism, the task was for men consciously to return to what had been an unconscious, the primordial state of spontaneous harmony with nature. In other words, false Romanticism advocated, and still does, that conscious effort and will should strive to direct thinking to knowing and living in accordance with instinct. And indeed, the ultimate ideal of false Romanticism is that conscious thinking should strive to eliminate itself, so that men might return to primordial unconscious harmony with the natural world. As well as being regressive, it turns out that false Romanticism is both ineffective and counterproductive, playing into the hands of the intellect and enlightenment, and amplifying the power of empiricism. In a word, false Romanticism is impossible. We cannot return to the childhood of ourselves or our race. Therefore we face a forced choice between the mainstream degenerate Enlightenment intellectuality of directing consciousness at perceptual information and its symbolic representations, which has converged upon discovering, believing, and obeying whatever is currently dominant in society. Or else to aim for real Romanticism, which is to direct our conscious thinking at discovering, and living in accordance with, our intuitions. Understanding the significance of near-death experiences, NDEs. Bruce Charlton. I have not made any extensive investigation of the reports of near-death experiences, NDEs, beyond reading descriptions of such things, by people whose reliability and honesty I am not usually able to evaluate. Except that I am always suspicious of those who attempt to make money or get fame from reporting their purported paranormal or mystical experiences. Nonetheless, I have noticed that reports of NDEs have a broad consistency about them, which is in great contrast to the descriptions of heaven that have also been made over the centuries. It seems to me that NDE accounts are attempts to describe various personal experiences of the same objective thing, while instead accounts of heaven could well be descriptions of many uniquely personal and subjective experiences. My interpretation is that NDEs are a real thing that have actually happened to at least some of those who report them, while those who claim to describe heaven are mistaken, because they have not actually experienced heaven, but a variety of other states instead. I do not believe that anybody can experience heaven without being resurrected, which is not reversible. Therefore all valid accounts of heaven by mortal men must be second-hand, and, at best, derived from communication with those who inhabit heaven. Accounts of being in heaven will therefore be wrong or imagined, in some way or another. What about NDEs? What do they prove and how can they be explained? I think NDEs suggest that our conscious selves can exist in a spirit form that continues after death. This, indeed, is probably what happens in ordinary dreaming sleep, when our spirits likewise almost detach from our bodies and our consciousness stays with the spirit and leaves the body. Hence, our dream consciousness may then have a wide range of experiences not possible to the body. The spirit in sleep does, however, remain attached to the body, however tenuously, as evidenced by the fact we can be woken by things perceived by or done to the sleeping body, or else we would be dead. And the same applies to near-death experiences, because, of course, they may be near to death, but by definition the person does not actually die. In sum, near-death experiences seem to be some variant of a general phenomenon that also include dreaming sleep, and other types of delirium, for example due to pyrexia, intoxication, and many types of illness, happening when there is a near detachment of our conscious spirit self from our body. Such an experience may suggest that a further and complete separation of conscious spirit from body would be possible, and that then the detached spirit would remain alive, conscious, and purposive, at least for a while. This is how NDEs are often regarded as evidence for life after death, that is, for spiritual life continuing after death of the body. And furthermore, NDEs suggest that this continued spirit life is, at least initially, likely to be conscious, and the post-death spirit able to make decisions. By my understanding of salvation, it is from this post-mortal state of continued and conscious spirit existence following mortal death of the body, that men are able to choose to follow Jesus Christ to resurrection and eternal life in heaven, or else to reject that possibility, and choose something else. The self-destructiveness of evil may masquerade as self-sacrificing altruism. Bruce Charlton. One of the fundamental misunderstandings prevalent among intellectuals who deny the divine and spiritual basis of reality, is that they assume evil is ultimately a kind of selfishness. The assumption is that an evil person is one who pursues selfish goals without regard for others. These secular materialists believe that, although selfishness may take different forms in different people, evil is ultimately self-gratification, aiming at what I want, and what gives me gratification, instead of taking into account what other people want. This, in turn, leads to the idea that altruism, which entails self-sacrifice supposedly for the benefit of others, is the highest virtue. The reason I italicized supposedly for the benefit of others, is that the benefit of other people is, in practice, conjectural, and often disputed. What happens, in practice, is that everybody claims to be doing what they do for the benefit of others, and constructs rationalizations to prove this, but there is no objective standpoint from which to evaluate these counterclaims. Especially since comparing benefit involves trying to balance multiple and incommensurable factors, as when comparing the supposed psychological benefits of supposed freedom or supposed equality, with, for example, measurable material disadvantages such as increased death from violence, increased incidence of rape, increased disease and poverty. These examples are relevant because many secular left political triumphs that have been justified by benefits of freedom or equality, are accompanied or followed by large material disbenefits such as those listed. Because large-scale or mass benefits cannot easily or uncontroversially be measured, it is common to try and discern evil from good on the basis of who benefits from some course of action. In law, such a principle is termed cui bono. Thus, a great deal of debate concerns who benefits from policies in terms of money, or power, or, less often, some powerful gratification such as greed or sexual lust. The idea behind this is that evil is self-gratifying, and the implicit assumption of such reasoning is that those who propose some course of action but do not benefit from it, but who instead lose out from this course of action, are not motivated by evil. The idea that those who lose out must therefore be altruistic in motivation, and, as such, be good. Yet this is not true, because evil is often self-destructive. Indeed, evil is always self-destructive, in the end, because the nature of evil is to oppose good, i.e. to oppose God and divine creation. This means that, since all beings are created by God, and live inside God's created reality, all evil must, sooner or later, oppose its own well-being. My point here is that we ought not to be blinded to the operations of evil by the fact that evil people, i.e. people who have affiliated to the side of evil in the spiritual war of this world, may advocate and work for policies and actions that will harm themselves, and their own well-being. Also, that self-destructive behavior is not thereby altruistic. Just because a person or institution acts against their own gratification and best interests, does not mean they are acting for the well-being of others. Often enough, the covert intent is to cause harm to all of divine creation, including themselves. In other words, while evil may be selfish and self-gratifying at the expense of others, evil will eventually become merely spiteful, merely destructive, merely negative. This is not self-sacrifice, but self-hatred. Evil hates itself because itself is a part of God's creation, hence ultimately good by its nature. Attempted self-annihilation, suicide, is therefore the inevitable and only end point for successful evil. 10 years on. William Wildblood. This blog is now 10 years old, the first post here being on February 28, 2013. I don't suppose I thought it would last that long when I started it, but it has, because in a changing world with more and more spiritual challenges there still seem to be things to write about. It began as an extension of the book I wrote about my encounters with the spiritual beings I called the Masters in order to develop themes from that book, and it has done that, but it has also gone its own way over time. That means I hardly ever write about the Masters now, and it's true that I have not had any outer contact with them since 1999, so the title might seem redundant. However, I believe they lie behind many things I do write about. They themselves said that they sought to impress ideas on my brain, but this would be on a spiritual and non-verbal level which has to be translated by my own mind, so it does come from me in the form it comes out, but often, not always, of course, the seeds are planted by them. I should add that I am sure they do this with many people, wherever there is a receptive mind. My case is by no means exceptional. What I am saying is that the title still applies, though in an indirect way. I did consider changing it to just my name to mark the 10-year anniversary, but what would be the point? It is what it is and may as well remain that. Besides, if there is anything that marks this blog out, it would be my experience with the Masters. For new readers who aren't aware of that, I would refer them to the books on the right or else to this post, which is of a talk I gave a couple of years ago, but the essential point I wish to make here is that though it may seem we are on our own in this world, that is not the case. We are guided and supported by our spiritual teachers. Christians might call these guardian angels, and they are constantly trying to influence us for the good. But their object is to bring us up to their level, possibly so that we can perform the same function as they do for future generations, and so they cannot hold our hands as though we were spiritual babies. Now every serious believer is called to be a saint, and saints have to learn how to suffer. They also have to learn to be completely single-minded in their pursuit of God, a single-mindedness that should come from love. God is all around us, but He also withdraws so that we are obliged to go up to meet Him. That is, go up to meet Him where He truly is. This effort to meet Him on His own spiritual level will develop our spiritual faculties. It is the meeting with God that is the goal of all spiritual endeavor. The Masters are just staging posts on the greater journey, as is any spiritual teacher, but staging posts can be very helpful, and sometimes you can't get to journey's end without them. Their goal, as implied above, is to encourage us to develop our own relationship with God, and that has a twofold aspect. There is the relationship with God the Father, the transcendent creator of heaven and earth, and there is also the relationship with the God who dwells within our own hearts. If you restrict yourself to just one of these aspects, your spiritual development will be limited. Your path must encompass both to be true. Many times over the past 10 years I have written that this is a time of testing. Of course, that is always the case in earthly existence, but today the work of the past 2,000 years is coming to a head. You can tell this because at no other time has there been so little awareness of God. People have always sinned and behaved badly, but the culture was always religious. No longer. Now even religion is not religious for the most part. But that is good because it means we are being forced back on ourselves. We must become spiritually self-reliant if we want to become spiritually mature. This doesn't mean every man is his own pope, but every man must make his own connection to God. This is not an easy task because the fallen self within us constantly gets in the way, but making your own connection to God does not mean rejecting outside help in the form of scripture, religious teachings, whatever. It simply means not depending or relying on that outside help. Use it to illuminate your own soul. That is the proper goal of all spiritual endeavor.